morning of June 14, 1851, a house slave named Moses stood in his master's bedroom in a grand Charleston townhouse and confessed to murder. The confession was calm, measured, delivered in the same respectful tone he used to announce dinner or deliver correspondence. "Sir," he said to the constable who had been summoned to investigate the death of merchant Robert Ashford, "I killed him. I put the pillow over his face at dawn and held it there until he stopped breathing." The constable, a thick-necked man named Warner, stared at Moses in confusion. This made no sense. Every servant in the household, every neighbor on Trad Street, every business associate in the Charleston commercial district knew that Moses had saved Robert Ashford's life just 18 hours earlier. The entire city was talking about it. Moses the hero, Moses the devoted servant, Moses who had pulled his master from a burning carriage after a terrible accident on Meeting Street, suffering burns on his own hands and arms to drag the unconscious man to safety. And now Moses stood here, his bandaged hands held calmly at his sides, claiming to be a murderer. Warner looked past Moses to the bed, where Robert Ashford's body lay peaceful and still, his face showing no signs of struggle, no indication of the violence Moses described. The merchant looked as if he had simply died in his sleep, which was what everyone had assumed until Moses had walked into the drawing room where the family was gathering and made his extraordinary confession. "Why?" Warner asked, the only question that made sense. "Why would you save him yesterday just to kill him today?" Moses met the constable's eyes with a directness that was unusual for a slave addressing a white man in Charleston. "Because yesterday I didn't know what I learned last night," he said, "and once I knew, I couldn't let him live another day." The statement hung in the air, cryptic and disturbing. Warner felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. There was something in Moses's expression, a kind of terrible certainty, that suggested this was not the act of a madman or a sudden rage. This was something else entirely, something calculated and purposeful, that had transformed a loyal servant into a killer in the space of a single night. Moses had belonged to the Ashford family for 23 years, purchased at age 12 from a plantation in the South Carolina Low Country where he had been born, Weben II. Robert Ashford, then a young man of 25 building his import business, had bought Moses specifically for house service, recognizing in the boy an intelligence and composure that would serve well in the elegant Charleston home he was furnishing for his future bride. Moses had been trained meticulously in the arts of domestic service by the head housekeeper, learning to move through rooms like a shadow, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to maintain the elaborate machinery of a wealthy household. Over the years, Moses had become indispensable to Robert Ashford's life. He managed the household staff, oversaw the maintenance of the townhouse, accompanied his master on business trips, and served as a personal valet. The relationship between them was characterized by a kind of efficient intimacy that wealth and slavery created. Robert trusted Moses completely within the narrow boundaries that such trust could exist between owner and owned. Moses knew Robert's preferences in everything from breakfast to business correspondence, knew his moods and his weaknesses, knew secrets about his master's life that no one else knew. Charleston in 1851 was a city at the height of its prosperity, built on rice and cotton and the labor of enslaved people who outnumbered white residents, Web I. The grand houses along the Battery and in the historic district showcased wealth accumulated through the brutal mathematics of plantation agriculture and the domestic slave trade that continued despite growing tensions with the North. The Ashford townhouse on Trad Street was among the finest, a 3-story structure with high ceilings, elaborate moldings, and gardens that required constant attention. Robert Ashford was considered a progressive master by Charleston standards, which meant he rarely used physical punishment and allowed his house slaves certain privileges that field hands never enjoyed. Moses wore good clothes, ate well, and was permitted to move through the city with relative freedom when conducting his master's business. To outside observers, the relationship appeared almost benevolent, a testament to the fiction that slavery could be gentle, that some enslaved people were content in their bondage. But Moses, like every enslaved person, knew the reality beneath the veneer. He knew that his competence and reliability made him valuable, and that value provided a thin protection against the casual cruelties that defined the system. He had witnessed other slaves sold away from families, beaten for small infractions, degraded in ways large and small. He had learned to perform contentment while keeping his true self hidden in spaces so deep, even he sometimes forgot they existed. The accident had happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the commercial district. Robert Ashford had been conducting business at the Merchant Exchange, finalizing contracts for a shipment of goods from England. Moses had accompanied him, as always, carrying documents and serving as an extra set of hands. They had hired a carriage to return home, the summer heat making the walk uncomfortable for a man of Robert's position. The carriage was traveling north on Meeting Street when the horse, spooked by a dog darting into the road, reared violently. The driver lost control and the carriage lurched sideways, one wheel catching on a raised cobblestone. The vehicle overturned with a sound of splintering wood and screaming metal. The lantern that hung inside shattered, its oil spilling across the silk cushions and igniting immediately in the afternoon heat. Moses, who had been riding in the servant's position at the back, was thrown clear. He hit the cobblestones hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, pain shooting through his shoulder. But he was conscious and mobile. Robert Ashford was not as fortunate. The merchant had been trapped inside the overturning carriage, pinned by the door that had jammed shut. Through the small window, Moses could see his master unconscious, slumped against the seat while flames began to lick at the fabric around him. What happened next would be recounted in parlors and on street corners across Charleston for days afterward. Moses, without hesitation, ran to the overturned carriage and began pulling at the jammed door. The metal handle was already hot, burning his palms, but he didn't stop. The flames were growing, black smoke pouring from the carriage's interior. Bystanders gathered, some calling for help, others simply watching the spectacle, but no one moved to assist. Moses finally wrenched the door open, tearing skin from his burned hands. He reached into the smoke-filled interior and grabbed Robert's body, dragging his master from the wreckage. The merchant's clothes had begun to smolder, and Moses beat out the embers with his bare hands, adding new burns to the existing injuries. He pulled Robert away from the carriage, just as the entire vehicle became engulfed in flames, the heat so intense that the gathered crowd stepped back. A doctor was summoned, and both men were treated at the scene. Robert had a concussion and severe bruising but would recover. Moses's hands and forearms were badly burned, the flesh red and blistered. The doctor wrapped them carefully while praising Moses's bravery. "You saved your master's life," he said. "That's the kind of loyalty that reflects well on the entire system." Moses said nothing, merely nodded as the bandages were applied. Robert, conscious now and shaken, looked at Moses with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "I owe you my life." Moses met his master's eyes and said the expected words, "Just doing my duty, sir." They returned to the Trad Street house in the early evening, Robert leaning on Moses despite the slave's injured hands. The household was in an uproar when they arrived, the news of the accident having preceded them. Mrs. Catherine Ashford, Robert's wife of 15 years, rushed to her husband with tears streaming down her face. The two Ashford daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, hovered anxiously. The other house slaves gathered to hear the story, looking at Moses with expressions ranging from admiration to something more complicated. Robert was put to bed with instructions to rest, and a proper doctor was called to examine him more thoroughly. The doctor confirmed that Robert would be fine, that he had been extraordinarily lucky, that without Moses's quick action he would certainly have died in the fire. The family's gratitude toward Moses was effusive. Catherine insisted he be given the evening off to rest, that his burns be treated with the same care as her husband's, that he be provided with extra food and comfort. Moses accepted all of this with his usual quiet dignity, thanking the family appropriately, and retiring to the servants' quarters behind the main house. But instead of resting, he sat in the small room he shared with another house slave and stared at his bandaged hands. Something had shifted in him during those moments of pulling Robert from the burning carriage. He had acted on instinct, the way any person might act to save another human life. But now in the aftermath, he found himself questioning that instinct. Why had he risked himself for a man who owned him? Why had his body moved to save someone who had the legal right to sell him, to beat him, to dispose of him in any way he saw fit? The questions troubled him deeply, stirring up thoughts he usually kept buried. He was still sitting there when Catherine Ashford summoned him back to the main house. Robert wanted to see him, she said, to thank him properly. Moses rose and walked back through the garden, his burned hands throbbing with each step. Robert was propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. He dismissed Catherine and the girls, asking to speak with Moses privately. When they were alone, Robert studied Moses for a long moment before speaking. "I meant what I said earlier. I owe you my life. If there's anything within my power to give you as thanks, you need only ask." The offer hung in the air between them. Moses felt his heart begin to pound. He knew what he wanted to ask. The word was on his tongue, a word that enslaved people dreamed about but rarely dared to speak. "Freedom," he said quietly. "I would ask for my freedom, sir." Robert's expression changed, warmth draining from his face. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Finally, Robert shook his head slowly. "Moses, you know I can't do that. You're too valuable to this household. My wife depends on you. The entire functioning of this home depends on you. I can give you money, better quarters, privileges, but not that." Moses felt something crack inside him. A foundation he hadn't even known was there giving way. He had saved this man's life, literally pulled him from fire at great cost to himself, and still his humanity was worth less than his utility. "I understand, sir," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I knew you would," Robert said, relief evident in his tone. "You've always been reasonable, Moses. It's one of your best qualities." Moses was dismissed and returned to the servants' quarters. Moses sat in the darkness of his small room as the house settled into sleep around him. His hands throbbed beneath the bandages, each pulse of pain a reminder of what he had done and what it had cost him. The other house slave who shared his quarters, a young man named Daniel, had tried to talk to him earlier, tried to offer congratulations on his heroic act, but Moses had remained silent until Daniel gave up and went to sleep. Now Moses sat alone with thoughts that were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly unbearable. The realization that had been building in him all evening finally crystallized into certainty. He had spent 23 years performing the role of the devoted servant, the loyal slave who found purpose in serving his master's needs, Webias 1. He had told himself that his position in the house was better than laboring in the fields, that his relative comfort was something to be grateful for, that survival required accepting his condition with grace. He had become so skilled at this performance that he had almost convinced himself it was real. But Robert's refusal had stripped away every illusion. In that moment when his master had denied him the one thing that mattered, Moses had seen their relationship with brutal clarity. There was no loyalty between them, no bond of mutual respect or gratitude. There was only power and property, owner and owned. Moses could save Robert's life 100 times and still be nothing more than a valuable asset, a piece of machinery that happened to breathe and think and feel. The rage that filled Moses was unlike anything he had experienced before. It was not the hot anger of a moment, but something colder and more profound, a rage born from accumulated years of degradation and denial. He thought about all the ways he had diminished himself to survive, all the times he had swallowed his pride and his humanity to avoid punishment. He thought about his mother, sold away when he was 8 years old, her face a fading memory he could barely recall. He thought about the woman he had loved in his early 20s, another slave in a neighboring household, and how their master had refused to let them marry because it would complicate property arrangements. He thought about the future that stretched before him. Decades more of this same performance, growing old in service to a family that would never see him as fully human, dying eventually with nothing to show for his life except the comfort he had provided to people who owned him. The thought was unbearable. It was a kind of death in life, a slow erasure of everything that made existence meaningful. Moses stood and moved to the small window of his room. Outside, the Charleston night was humid and thick, the smell of jasmine heavy in the air. The city slept peacefully, built on the labor and suffering of thousands of people like him, people whose stories would never be recorded, whose lives would be footnotes in other people's histories. He felt the weight of all those invisible lives pressing down on him, felt the enormity of the injustice that surrounded him on every side. And then, with a clarity that felt almost like peace, Moses understood what he needed to do. He could not free himself through Robert's mercy, that much was clear. But there was another kind of freedom available to him, one that required courage of a different sort. If he was going to die a slave anyway, either worked to death or sold away, or simply ground down by years of servitude, then he could choose to die having struck one blow against the system that had destroyed him. He could take from Robert Ashford what Robert had taken from him, a future, a life, the possibility of everything that might have been. The decision settled into Moses with a weight that was almost physical. He was not a violent man by nature. In 23 years of bondage he had never raised his hand against anyone. But he understood now that there were forms of violence beyond the physical, that what had been done to him and millions of others was violence on a scale that dwarfed any individual act. What he planned was not murder in any meaningful sense. It was justice, or as close to justice as he could achieve, in a world structured to deny it to him. He waited until the house was completely quiet, until he could hear nothing but the distant sounds of the city and the closer sound of Daniel's breathing. Then he rose and moved silently through the servants' quarters, through the garden, into the main house. He knew every floorboard that creaked, every door that squeaked. He had lived in this house for over 2 decades, knew it better than the family who owned it. He moved like a ghost through the familiar spaces, up the servants' stairs to the second floor where the family bedrooms were located. Robert's door was unlocked. Moses opened it slowly, inches at a time, until he could slip through. The room was dark except for the faint light from the window. Robert lay in bed sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and regular, still recovering from the trauma of the accident. Moses stood for a moment looking down at the man who owned him, feeling nothing but a distant sense of necessity. He picked up a pillow from the chair beside the bed. His burned hands screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. The Ashford household woke to Catherine's screams. She had entered her husband's bedroom at dawn, as was her custom, to check on his recovery from the accident. What she found was Robert's body, cold and still, his face peaceful but lifeless. The doctor was summoned immediately, along with the constable, though Catherine insisted initially that her husband must have simply died from complications of his injuries. The trauma to his head, the smoke inhalation, surely these had claimed him in the night. Webb, too. But when Constable Warner arrived and examined the body, he found small hemorrhages in Robert's eyes, a sign that he had been suffocated. The discovery transformed what had appeared to be a tragic natural death into something far more sinister. Warner began questioning the household immediately, starting with the family and moving to the servants. Every slave was brought before him one by one, asked to account for their movements during the night, asked if they had seen or heard anything unusual. It was during this process that Moses walked calmly into the drawing room where the questioning was taking place and made his confession. Warner, who had been interviewing the cook, stared at Moses in disbelief as the slave explained in simple, clear language exactly what he had done. "I killed Master Ashford," Moses said. "I put a pillow over his face at dawn and held it there until he stopped breathing." The room erupted. Catherine Ashford, who had been sitting nearby with her daughters, let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. The other slaves, who had been waiting to be questioned, shrank back as if Moses had become something dangerous and contagious. Warner stood slowly, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt, though Moses made no move to flee or resist. "You saved his life yesterday," Warner said, echoing the same confusion he would express again moments later. "Why in God's name would you kill him today?" Moses's answer, that he had learned something in the night that made Robert's continued existence impossible, only deepened the mystery. Warner had Moses shackled immediately and taken to the city jail, a grim building on Magazine Street, where slaves and free blacks accused of crimes were held. The interrogation continued there, with Warner joined by other city officials and several prominent citizens who had known Robert Ashford and wanted to understand what had driven his trusted servant to murder. Moses answered their questions patiently, but revealed nothing beyond his initial statement. Yes, he had killed Robert Ashford. Yes, he had done it deliberately and with full understanding of the consequences. No, he had not been angry in the moment, had not acted in passion or rage. He had simply recognized a necessity and acted on it. When pressed about what he had learned that night that had prompted this action, Moses remained silent, his face composed, his eyes distant. The city of Charleston was scandalized. The story spread through the commercial district, through the churches, through the elegant homes along the Battery. Moses the hero had become Moses the murderer in the space of a single night, and no one could explain the transformation. Some speculated that the smoke inhalation from the fire had damaged his mind, that he had gone temporarily insane. Others suggested that he had always harbored resentment and had simply been waiting for an opportunity. A few darker voices whispered that this was evidence of the inherent savagery of the African race, proof that even the most civilized slave could revert to violence without warning. The Ashford family was devastated and confused. Catherine could not reconcile the Moses she had known for 15 years, reliable, respectful, seemingly content, with the man who had murdered her husband. The daughters were frightened, suddenly aware that the people who had served them their entire lives were strangers, whose inner thoughts remained unknowable. The household slaves were terrified, knowing that Moses's act would bring suspicion and harsher treatment down on all of them, that white Charleston would see this as a betrayal that required punishment, beyond just the individual perpetrator. A trial was scheduled, though its outcome was never in doubt. South Carolina law provided only one punishment for a slave who murdered his master: death. The trial would be a formality, a way for the white community to reassert control and demonstrate the consequences of stepping outside the bounds of acceptable slave behavior. Moses would hang, and his execution would serve as a warning to every other enslaved person in the city. The trial took place 2 weeks after the murder, in a sweltering courtroom packed with spectators eager to witness the proceedings. Moses was brought in wearing shackles, his burned hands now healed enough that the bandages had been removed, leaving angry red scars across his palms and forearms. He stood before the judge, a white-haired man named Preston, who had presided over numerous slave trials, and listened as the charges were read. Murder in the first degree, the killing of Robert Ashford, merchant and respected citizen of Charleston. The prosecution presented its case efficiently. Constable Warner testified about Moses's confession. The doctor who had examined Robert's body testified about the cause of death. Catherine Ashford, dressed in black mourning clothes, testified tearfully about discovering her husband's body and about Moses's years of apparently loyal service. The evidence was overwhelming and uncontested. Moses had killed Robert Ashford. He had confessed to it. There was no question of guilt. But the question of motive remained, and it was this question that dominated the trial's second day. The prosecutor, an ambitious young lawyer named Simmons, who saw this case as an opportunity to make his reputation, pressed Moses relentlessly about why he had committed the crime. "You saved this man's life," Simmons said, pacing before the witness stand where Moses sat. "He trusted you. He treated you well by all accounts. What could possibly have driven you to such a heinous betrayal?" Moses had remained silent on this question for 2 weeks, but something in the courtroom atmosphere, in the rows of white faces staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, loosened something in him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear enough to carry through the room. "He refused to free me," Moses said. "I asked for my freedom as payment for saving his life, and he refused." The courtroom erupted with murmurs and gasps. Judge Preston banged his gavel for order. Simmons stared at Moses, and a smile slowly spread across the prosecutor's face. "So you killed him out of spite," he said, "because he wouldn't reward you the way you wanted?" "No," Moses said, and there was something in his tone that made the room quiet. "I killed him because in that refusal, I finally understood what I was to him. Not a person. Not someone whose loyalty and service and sacrifice meant anything beyond their utility. Just property. Valuable property that he would no more free than he would throw away a good horse or a productive piece of land." He paused, and in the silence, something shifted. Moses looked out at the courtroom, at the white faces that held his life in their hands, and decided that if he was going to die, he would at least speak truth before the end. "I spent 23 years making myself useful to Robert Ashford," he continued. "I learned to anticipate his needs, to manage his household, to be invisible when he wanted privacy and available when he needed assistance. I saved his life at cost to myself. And when I asked for the one thing that every human being desires, freedom, he denied me as casually as he might deny a child a sweet before dinner. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even Simmons seemed uncertain how to respond to this articulate explanation, this reasoning that made a terrible kind of sense, even as it confirmed Moses's guilt. Moses kept speaking, the words flowing from him now like water from a broken dam. I realized that night that I would never be free through his mercy or through my own service, that I could save his life 100 times and still die in bondage, that the only choice I had was how I would die, as a slave who had spent his entire life serving other people's comfort, or as a man who had struck one blow for his own humanity. He looked directly at Judge Preston. So I chose. I killed him, and I would do it again. The admission sent another wave of shock through the courtroom. Catherine Ashford sobbed openly. Several men in the gallery shouted for Moses to be hanged immediately, but there were others, a very few, who sat silent with troubled expressions, as if Moses's words had touched something they would prefer to keep buried. Web 1. Judge Preston called for order and adjourned the trial for deliberation, though everyone knew the verdict was predetermined. Moses was returned to his cell, where he sat in the darkness and felt something like peace. He had spoken truth publicly, had articulated what he suspected thousands of enslaved people felt, but could never say. Whether anyone had heard him, whether his words would make any difference, he didn't know. But he had said them, and that was enough. The verdict came the following day. Guilty of murder in the first degree, with a sentence of death by hanging to be carried out in 1 week's time. Moses received the judgment without visible emotion, standing straight and dignified as Preston pronounced the sentence. He was returned to jail to await execution, and Charleston settled back into its familiar rhythms, the scandal of the Ashford murder becoming another story to be told and retold in various versions. But Moses's testimony had created ripples that spread in unexpected directions. His words were repeated in kitchens and parlors, in churches and on street corners. Some white Charlestonians dismissed them as the ravings of a murderer trying to justify his crime, but others, particularly those who had some education and some exposure to the abolitionist arguments coming from the North, found themselves troubled by what Moses had said. The logical simplicity of his reasoning was difficult to refute. He had saved a life and been denied the one reward that mattered, so he had taken what he couldn't be given. Among the enslaved population of Charleston, Moses's act and his testimony took on the character of legend almost immediately. Here was someone who had chosen death over continued bondage, who had spoken truth to power, even knowing it would cost him everything. His story spread through the invisible networks that connected slaves across the city, carried in whispers and coded songs, transformed in the telling into something larger than one man's act of desperate resistance. Web 2. The execution was scheduled for a Friday morning at dawn. A scaffold was erected in the public square, and a crowd gathered to witness the spectacle. Public executions of slaves were meant to serve as warnings, demonstrations of white power, and the consequences of stepping outside the bounds of acceptable behavior. The crowd that morning included plantation owners and merchants, laborers and street vendors, free blacks forced to witness the fate that awaited any who challenged the system, and enslaved people brought by their masters to learn the same lesson. Moses was brought to the scaffold in shackles, walking with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his trial. A minister offered him a chance to confess his sins and seek forgiveness, but Moses declined politely. "I've already confessed," he said, "and I'm not sorry." As the noose was placed around his neck, Moses looked out at the assembled crowd. His eyes found the section where enslaved people stood, and he held their gazes for a long moment. Some would later say that he smiled, that same mysterious expression that would be debated and discussed for years afterward. Not joy, not triumph, but something like recognition, like understanding, like a secret shared among those who understood what it meant to live without freedom. The executioner asked if he had any last words. Moses was silent for a moment, then spoke loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "I saved a life and took a life," he said. "The first was instinct. The second was choice. I chose to die a man rather than live as property. Remember that." The words echoed across the square, as the trapdoor opened and Moses dropped, his neck breaking instantly. The crowd dispersed slowly, some satisfied that justice had been served, others troubled in ways they couldn't fully articulate. The Ashford family went home to continue their mourning, now doubled. The enslaved people returned to their labor, carrying Moses's final words with them like seeds that would germinate in soil watered by suffering. In the months and years that followed, the story of Moses, who saved his master and then killed him, became part of Charleston's complicated history. Some told it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting slaves too much, of giving them privileges that made them forget their place. Others told it as evidence of the inherent instability of a system built on human bondage, proof that no amount of apparent contentment could mask the fundamental injustice at slavery's core. But among the enslaved people of Charleston and beyond, Moses's story became something else, a reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, even when every external choice had been taken away, the choice of how to face death remained. That a person could decide that their humanity mattered more than their survival, that dignity could be worth the ultimate price. Moses had lived 23 years as property, but he had died as a man who had chosen his own fate. And in that choice, he had demonstrated a freedom that no law or custom could grant or deny, a freedom that existed in the core of human consciousness, where no chains could reach. The grave where Moses was buried, in the potter's field outside Charleston where executed criminals and enslaved people without families were interred, had no marker. But his name lived on in whispered stories and coded songs, in the collective memory of people who understood what his choice had meant. He had saved a life because his humanity demanded it, and he had taken a life because that same humanity could no longer bear the denial of its own worth. The contradiction was the point. It revealed the impossible position that slavery created, the moral paradoxes that could only be resolved through acts that looked like madness to those who had never lived without freedom. Moses's smile, if he had indeed smiled at the end, was the smile of someone who had finally reconciled those contradictions in the only way available to him. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.